Okay, welcome to this webinar on Pathway Mentoring for Beginners. We're going to get started. So what we're going to cover today is essentially a few different things. We're going to be looking at, very briefly, how the pathway works and why it is as it is, what the role of mentor actually involves. Then we're going to move on to deadlines and look at how they fall and how to plan for them, consider the workload and so on. Candidate submissions we'll be covering as well, and what to look for in those, along with your own mentor reviews and what to look for in those, including what the supervisor looks for in those. We'll then be moving on to actually look at the stages, which isn't on that list, but we are going to do that, the stage definitions of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Before we move then on to assessing your candidate, and then, as I said, also what your supervisor needs from you, and then we'll just quickly summarise at the end. So hopefully that sounds okay to everyone. Before I begin, I just wanted to emphasise that the syllabus I'll be referring to and the stage definitions I'll be referring to during this session are those for the new syllabus. So this is the syllabus for people not taking the exam this year. If your candidate is taking the exam in November, it's not a problem, but most of what I say will still be completely relevant to you, but just bear in mind that you'll be looking at the new syllabus, version 6, rather than the old one, version 5. So, as I said, just before we started, if you have any questions, there is a chat window down here somewhere. You can submit questions to that. I will answer questions at the end, or feel free to discuss things amongst yourselves. And if you have any additional questions afterwards and haven't got a chance to contact me, then do have a look at the resources, which are online, and there's everything you need to know is online. If you go to landscapeinstitute.org, click on Education, and then click on Pathway, you'll find it there without having to log in. So why is the pathway as it is? Well, it's all down to the professional development cycle, which is something that career development professionals, such as myself, came up with back in the 70s. The traditional cycle is plan, do, reflect, record. But recently, certainly within the last 10 years or so, feedback has been added into that cycle and is now seen by pretty much all professional bodies as an essential part of the professional development cycle. So with this model, plan, do, reflect, record, and then feedback, we developed the pathway. And here you've pretty much got plan, do, record, and then reflect as well, doing your feelings, doing your submission, and then we've got 2 lots of feedback in here as well before we start planning again. So that's why the pathway is as it is. It wasn't just kind of invented at random by the people who were working on, the members who were working on it back in 2006, 2007. It's not quite that old. So for those of you that are beginning at mentoring, you've probably already had a candidate register. So you'll have gone through the registration process. You'll have had an email asking you if you want to accept their nomination. And once you've done that, I'll have approved you to the system. And the next stage is the initial review. Now, the initial review is very similar to the mentor review. So those of you that have done it have already had an idea of the mentor review. The idea of the initial review is essentially to capture all the knowledge and understanding that the candidate had before they joined the pathway in one place. So it's basically whenever a candidate rings me up and asks me whether the experience they've had before they joined the pathway counted, what I always say to them is yes, absolutely, and the initial review is where you capture all of that past experience, all the past knowledge that they've gained. Once the initial review's gone on to the system, the candidate can then record their development and make their first submission. Mentor submits a mentor review. We'll be looking at that in more detail later on. And then we get into the general cycle of things. Now, in fact, when the candidate, before the candidate is able to take the exam, they go through this general cycle. But when we get to the mentor review, we also have something additional known as the notification. And so that comes along as part of the mentor review. The notification goes as part of the mentor review to the supervisor. The supervisor then says accept or decline. And if they've accepted, the candidate can then register for the exam. If they've declined, then the candidate goes back on to plan for the coming quarter and goes round and round the circle again. Okay, so that's essentially how the pathway works. There's no minimum time that people need to spend on the pathway, so if your candidate is ready to take the exam straight away, then they can. That's not a problem at all. Okay, so that was a very brief overview of what the pathway is, but now let's look at being a mentor. And basically, as it says, a mentor is someone who helps others develop. And specifically within the pathway, the mentor helps the candidate develop the knowledge they need to pass the exam. And I'm always saying to candidates, it's never too early to start thinking about the exam, because that is the eventual test. It's like when you're learning to drive. Your driving instructor is always telling you to look in the mirror. At least they did when I was doing it, every 6 seconds, I think it is, because that's what the examiner is going to be looking out for. Not because once you've passed, you'll be having to look in the mirror every 6 seconds. This is just what you need to show to be chartered. You know, in later life, it's unlikely that a client will ask you to explain from first principles how the planning process works. So it's entirely possible, of course. They're more likely to want you to tell them how to get their application or their plan in particular approved. So anyway, the mentor is responsible for helping the candidate pass and for helping them develop and build on the knowledge that they need that's relevant to the syllabus. But also, and perhaps more importantly, the mentor is also helping the candidate from a more longer term point of view develop the kind of attitudes and skills that are going to shape them into a fully rounded, fully professional, fully competent, not getting sued, chartered landscape architect in the future. Now, a lot of people work in the same office as their candidate, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, that very much used to be expected when the pathway first launched. It's becoming less common as the recession has taken its toll, and there's fewer landscape architects in one office, for example, and more people now have an external mentor. But wherever you are, there's an important difference between being a staff manager, which I imagine many of you have had experience of, and being a mentor. So I just wanted to go through a few of these. Just in the first place, a manager is likely to set objectives, specifically around appraisal time or when a new piece of work has been allocated to them and they're delegating some of those bits to their staff member who may well be a candidate. So while a manager is setting objectives, a mentor is much more likely to be agreeing goals. Okay, so you want the candidate to take ownership of their development. So slight change in emphasis there. It's not you telling the candidate what they should achieve. It's the candidate identifying what they should achieve and you agreeing that that's a suitable goal, or perhaps advising them, to break it up into chunks and just get there a bit at a time. Similarly, a manager might identify a performance issue or a problem, whereas a mentor is hopefully identifying opportunities. So where a manager might be concerned that the staff member, the candidate, isn't terribly good in client meetings, the mentor will say, okay, well, we know this is a weakness. We know this is an area you want to work on, and client relationships is part of the syllabus. So let's see what opportunities we have to develop this, either within the office, if you're all in the same office, or perhaps shadowing, sitting in on someone else's client meetings, or, are there skills, say at a study group, where you can pick up tips on how other people approach these kind of meetings, okay? So rather than seeing things as problems, seeing them as opportunities. Thirdly, a manager may well be concerned with what's going on right now, because that's what's important to them. And indeed, some managers, especially good ones, are looking ahead to the future. But a mentor is thinking in the longer term. They're not quite so worried if something isn't going terribly well right at this moment, because they know they've got the long-term perspective, which sometimes a candidate can lack, especially if they're getting quite stressed and anxious. That it doesn't, it's not the end of the world if the client meeting, for example, didn't go terribly well today. Let's think about how we can improve it, and so that in 6 months' time, you'll be achieving X, Y, Z. Then work out the steps that you need to take to get there. And then finally, a manager is wanting to achieve results in the short term. They need to deliver projects on time, on budget, achieve certain levels of satisfaction, hopefully get some repeat custom. Whereas your mentor, as I said earlier, has this longer term perspective and is more interested in getting better results for tomorrow, unless, of course, it happens to be the day of the exam, when you may well be hoping that they achieve the result on that specific day. Okay, so that's just a quick introduction to how the perspectives between manager and mentor vary. Now, the key to success that I've always found when I've been a mentor, and indeed when I've been mentored by others, is that you need to dedicate time for mentoring. Okay, it's not enough to try and incorporate it into normal management meetings that you might have with a staff member, because mentoring tends to get lost. You need to, what was his name? The man who had the different coloured hats. Edward, something like that. And he actually had some fairly senior city type company people with different coloured baseball hats, and they would take one off and put another one on in order to consider a situation from a different perspective. And it sounds pretty extraordinary, very 80s. They used to have different coloured hats woven into the carpet patterns. But anyway, we wouldn't go that far now. But it's useful to set aside specific time for mentoring rather than trying to combine it with something else. Those of you that are external mentors really have a bit of an advantage when it comes to this. Something rare, I know, when you're trying to manage any kind of long-distance relationship, whether it's mentoring or personal. Although it might be harder for you to arrange to meet, when you do, whether that's in person or on Skype, you know that you're there for a specific purpose and you're not going to get kind of distracted by office telephones ringing or someone popping in with a message or a manager asking their staff member, what's up with the deadline, with the work that's due for the deadline tomorrow. Now, speaking of deadlines, nice little segue there, I thought. We have fixed deadlines on the Pathway, and I'm sure you are all familiar with these. However, little mentoring you've done on the Pathway before, and I think I recognise most of the names and I know that you've been around for a little while. The deadlines are fairly easy to work out once you know the pattern. We have the 4 quarters. Quarter 1, 2, 3, 4. They are calendar quarters rather than school year quarters or academic quarters or anything else. And the candidate deadline is always the last day of the quarter. So it's always, the end of March, the end of June, September and December. All right. Now the mentor deadline, your deadline, is always a week after that. So it's always the 7th of the first month of the next quarter. All right, so essentially it's a week after the end of the quarter. So for the quarter we're in at the moment, quarter 3, you've got a mentor deadline of 7th of October, and hopefully you've all got that in your diaries already. Now, deadlines are always on midnight on the day, so as you get to the 7th of October, you'll get to 9 a.m. and you'll undoubtedly have submitted your mentor review by then, but let's say that BT have accidentally lost your internet connection in the area, and it might get to 9 p.m. and you haven't submitted yet, you've still got a little while. If it gets to 11:59 p.m., that is 1 minute from the deadline. Some people get confused about whether midnight means midnight on the day or midnight before the day, but it's midnight on the day. And then, of course, your supervisors have between 3 and 4 weeks to hear feedback once you've submitted and your candidate has submitted. Now, your supervisor will feedback if just one of you has submitted, but of course they won't feedback if neither of you have submitted because there'll be nothing for them to feedback on. Supervisor feedback is always visible if you click on My Candidates and View All. You'll always be able to see everything that's been submitted on the Pathway system. Those of you who have candidates who were on the old syllabus and have just recently moved to the new syllabus, when you click on View All for your candidates, you also then need to go to the By Pack tab at the top of the screen, and that will show you all the development packs that have been submitted, and you'll be able to download a PDF for each one. Okay. Now, it's very important that you're always aware of the deadlines. So I do strongly recommend that you mark all the submission deadlines in your diary, but also just be aware of how much you've got going on, not just on the day of the deadline, but in the run-up to the deadline. And it's perfectly acceptable to submit early. It's not a problem. If you or your candidate has absolutely masses on or are going off travelling, one of you's having a baby, caring for a sick relative, whatever it is, you can submit after as little as a week of a quarter. Okay, so effectively submitting more than 2.5 months early, not a problem. Doesn't need to be arranged to meet, you just go ahead and do it. However, more usually, if you have things going on the deadline, or if it's Easter or Christmas or something like that, you can say to your candidate, I need you to submit by, let's say the 16th of September. Because you've got a lot on the bank holiday. No, sorry, I was looking at August. You've got a lot on in the last 2 weeks of September. So you need your candidate to submit so that you can then submit a few days later. That's absolutely fine. It should always be your candidate submitting first, because otherwise there's potential that your candidate will then add things afterwards that aren't mentioned in your mentor review, and that can be quite confusing for your supervisor and look like you kind of accidentally omitted something. It's always your candidate's responsibility to drive the process. They are in charge of their own career development. Their destiny is in their hands, and to be a little bit dramatic, but of course there's nothing wrong with giving them a nudge. If you have tried nudging your candidate and they haven't responded or haven't done what they said they would, well, that's going to be tough on them when they suddenly realise that they haven't done something and want you to do something last minute. But, that's just how life is, really. If you can't then fit in with their plans, that's a valuable life lesson for them. So, no bother at all with giving the candidate a bit of a kick every now and again, but you don't have to. It's ultimately, it's entirely the candidate's responsibility to keep up to date and to let you know of what they need from you. If you can, it's useful to hold regular update meetings. In a couple of the other webinars, I've been asking people to suggest how often they meet with their mentor or with their candidate, and it looks like the usual number of meetings per quarter, this is every 3 months, is 2 to 4. And that's perfectly suitable. You have a meeting sometime after the supervisor feedback comes out, so you can just discuss that and modify any plans you've made for the coming quarter. Have a meeting at the end of the quarter, so you can conduct your mentor review and review your candidate's knowledge. And then if your candidate is either just at the beginning of the pathway or at the very end, near the exams, they may well need additional support from you during the quarter. And in any case, it does no harm just to touch base, a 5-minute phone call, a quick email, just to see how each of you is getting on. Is no problem at all. If your candidate is right at the beginning, they may need a bit more support from you. And if they're right near the exams, then hopefully you'll be thinking about holding mock exams and meeting up or meeting online to actually hold those. Now, as I said, always review your workload as the deadline approaches, and I'll be talking a bit more about that in a moment. And, of course, submit your mentor review by the deadline. There's always a couple each quarter who meant to submit and just click save. And unfortunately, when the deadline passes, anything that hasn't been submitted is deleted from the system because we don't assume that you wanted it to be seen by a third party if you haven't actually submitted it yourself. So always check that you've submitted. When you do submit, you'll get an email confirming that your submission has been received. You'll also see that it no longer appears on your tasks menu, or the only task that is there is for the mentor review for the following quarter. So 2 easy ways to check that your submission has actually gone in. Now, manage your workload. It's all very well to know the deadlines and to know that you can submit early if needed, but it's very difficult sometimes when last-minute things do come up. Now, there are 3 reasons for an extension, and you shouldn't hesitate to ask for one if you meet one of these 3 reasons. I can give an extension of up to 2 weeks if there has been a bereavement, and sadly these things do happen to all of us from time to time. If you or a dependent has a serious illness, so it doesn't necessarily have to be you, if someone that relies on you has a serious illness and you need to look after them, child, parent, partner, whatever, then that is grounds for an extension. And the third thing, which seems to affect mentors a surprisingly large number of times, is what I call an act of God, where someone is stranded in a place without internet because of a volcano, or there's been a flood, or some terrible thing has happened. Plane has decided not to take off. you know, things like this are all grounds for an extension. Having lots of work is not grounds for an extension. Having a wedding or a honeymoon is not grounds for an extension, because these things are very rarely happen as a complete surprise. Having a baby is grounds for an extension, because they do sometimes happen as a surprise. So if any of those things happen to you, do contact me and ask for an extension. Even if it's after the deadline, we can always backtrack and open things up again. However, do be aware that I won't grant an extension for anything else. Regular meetings with your candidate mean that there's less likely to be sudden, unexpected weddings and honeymoons, for example. And, you know, then you can just let them know if you're going to need them to submit early. If you ask them to submit early and they don't, and that means that you can't submit, well, that's the candidate's loss. It's just one of those things. And of course, remember that there is a number of things that aren't explicitly said on the syllabus, but are regardless an important skill for a professional chartered landscape architect to have. And time management and the ability to meet deadlines is certainly one of those. And I imagine each of you could give me examples of where a deadline was missed and a tender didn't go in on time and work was lost, or, you know, the office lost out in some way. So it's definitely an important skill for any professional landscape architect to have. Now, we all know the story about, or the saying about giving a man a fish and feeding him for a day, and teaching him to fish and feeding him for as long as the fish stocks last. The best way you can help your candidate is to teach them how to go fish for environmental impact assessments and so on themselves, or help them develop that knowledge. It's really important, though, that you test that knowledge and understanding, and I'll come on to this later. There's no assumptions on the pathway. The candidates will not say to, the examiners will not say to the candidate in an exam, do you know about environmental impact assessments? And then be satisfied if the candidate says yes. That will never get them a pass in the exam. So it's always important not to assume that a candidate knows about something. And it is easy to assume that, especially if you work with them and you've seen them do it in the office. Someone can be a demon at batch surveys, for example, in the office and carry them out on a daily basis. But when it comes to describing the theoretical basis of it, and then, you know, transferring that knowledge to a different situation to one they're used to working in, not everyone is as good as communicating. And again, oral communication is another skill that we are testing on the pathway as we go through. So yes, never assume that someone will be able to communicate something just because they know about it, which sounds a little bit odd, I know, but hopefully you know what I mean. And the best way to help your candidate is to give them constructive feedback. And I often talk to the supervisors about a feedback sandwich, where you have something positive, then you put the not so positive stuff in the middle, and then you end on a positive as well. So constructive feedback, where you're talking about something that's not going well, but giving an indication of what could make it better, or, you know, offering them help to make it better, is always something that's very valuable to your candidate. Now, moving on to your candidate submission, this is what your supervisor and you will see from your candidate when they submit. A number of you will have seen a submission already. If you haven't seen what your candidate enters on the system yet, then just ask them to log in when you're there and to show you around. There's an overview of what they see in the Mentor User Guide, which is one of the resources on the website, but it's always useful just to see what the other guy sees. The candidate submission is made up of 3 pieces: the multiple development logs, which are describing what it is they're actually doing, projects, which obviously describes the project that they're working on, and then a quarterly statement, which is a much more concise kind of overview, a bit more reflective. And each of these need to be concise. And in fact, the quarterly statement, there's a limit to the number of characters a candidate can enter on that. Now, historically, we've had a number of problems with candidates writing too much in their development log. And I think it's ultimately come down to the fact that candidates were using these as revision notes. And of course, they're not revision notes. And you might think, well, it doesn't really matter if they're doing that. And that's one point of view. But the candidate is asking you to read the development logs. You're a professional landscape architect. Your time is valuable. They're also then asking the supervisor to read their development logs, because the supervisor needs to read them in order to feedback on them, and the supervisor is a professional landscape architect. And they're then asking the examiner to read them as well, because the examiner needs to read them to prepare for the exams. So all in all, they're using the time of 3 professional landscape architects that could be used in other ways, because you don't need to know the ABCs of bat surveys. You probably already know them, either that or you don't need to know them. So you don't need to read all that stuff, and certainly the examiners and the supervisors don't need to know it either. So the development log, what we say to candidates is that what was done is actually a minor part of the contents of a development log, just a sentence or 2. I went to a planning inquiry. I saw the planning process unveiled before my eyes. You can tell I've not been to one. Then the key thing is that the candidate is reflecting on what they've actually learnt. So they may well mention what it is they've learnt, nothing wrong with that, that's not a revision note. But then they're thinking about how that relates to the syllabus, and also how it fits in with other syllabus areas, and perhaps even other projects that they're working on as well. So if they're writing paragraphs about what it was they did in step-by-step fashion, like you might do on what I did on my holidays at school, then you want to discourage that with your candidate, because it's just wasting your time and also those of other people. So that's the candidate submission. We're now going to go on to look at your own mentor review. And in fact, let's just have a quick look at this here. So this is what the mentor review looks like. Those of you that have just filled out an initial review, you'll just have essentially, sorry, I managed to highlight the wrong one then. You'll essentially just have filled out one side of this in your initial review. Let's just go back. So in a mentor review, you should always add a comment where there's been an activity, even if that hasn't resulted in a change from 0 to 1 or 0 to 2, 1 to 2, and so on. Just because it's really a very positive experience for the candidate to know that what they're doing is being appreciated. It sounds like a silly thing, but it actually means a lot to candidates to know that that is happening, and I give the same guidance to supervisors as well. Stage changes do need to be evidenced, so it's not mandatory to add a comment unless there's been a change from 1 to 2, say. But I would always recommend that you do add comments, but it does become mandatory when there has been a change. Okay, so any time that you have changed the candidate's stage score from 1 to 2, you must add a comment, and in fact you won't be able to submit your mentor review until you have done that. And then also, it's important to correlate what you say with your candidate's submission, and that's why I always say that candidates must submit first before the mentors. Because if you're saying that a candidate has reached stage 3 in a particular syllabus area, that's fine, they may well have done, you've tested their knowledge. But if the candidate hasn't submitted a development log saying that they've done something to do with stage 3, then the supervisor is going to be querying that and suspecting that something odd has happened. So it's important that what you are saying with your stage scores does relate to what the candidate is submitting in their submission, and the supervisors will check and will look for some correlation between the two. Now, I said here is your mentor review. Now, one thing you'll notice when you go to do the mentor review for quarter 3 for candidates if your candidate was previously on the old syllabus, is that all of the scores last quarter have been reset to 0. So in fact, it will just be this column which has got the ticks in. There won't be any ticks in any of the other columns. Now, this isn't a bug. This is because there was no mapping, or is no mapping, between the old syllabus and the new syllabus. The new syllabus is entirely new. It's not an update of the old syllabus. It's not refreshing the language or updating the terms. It's entirely new, based on an entirely different structure. And there's much more about the syllabus and description of each of the sections and why it became what it is in the Introduction to Pathway 2.0 webinar, which is on YouTube already. So that's why all the stages scores last quarter have been reset to 0. You'll then be able to make them the proper scores that they should be over in the score this quarter. And as with the initial review, you just basically click to change the scores. You'll then be asked to write something to basically justify or evidence why those scores have been given. Now, the amount you write will vary depending on how much the candidate has actually done during that quarter. And as I said earlier, if the candidate has done something but it wasn't enough to cause a stage score change, then I'd always advise you still to mention it in there, even if you're not changing the little radio buttons above. Now, this is the case for learning objectives 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are the core objectives. We've then, of course, got the underpinning objectives. And for the underpinning objectives, it's just the box at the bottom, the text box, which you'll be asked to complete. Okay, so there's no stage scores for the 2 underpinning objectives that are 5 and 6 within the syllabus. Now let's look at the stage definitions. I think 0 is pretty obvious, that there's little or no understanding. But stage 1, you have some basic knowledge, or the candidate has a basic knowledge, and they're understanding basic concepts. So at stage 0, the candidate didn't really know what they don't know, but by stage 1, they do know what they don't know. They know the shape of the subject area, and they are aware of which legislation covers it or what concepts it involves, and they may well have an awareness of how it fits into the kind of projects that are going on in their office. But they certainly won't have looked at any specific applications in any specific context. But they have awareness of it, and they've read the basics about it, wouldn't discuss that with you. So you'll have tested that knowledge and tested that they have the basic knowledge and understand the basic concepts in order to give them stage 1 score. Now, by the time we get on to stage 2, and these definitions are different to the ones on the old syllabus, we're looking for them to have a general knowledge with some experience possibly of applying that knowledge, but they would at least be able to talk about how they could apply that knowledge. So at this point, it may well be theoretical knowledge, but they're probably still going to need to ask for advice and approval from someone like yourself who's more senior and more experienced. Okay, so what the standard we're looking for in the exam, and remember I said it was never too early to talk about the exam, is a majority of stage 2s, as it was on the old syllabus, but big change, they must be able to show stage 3 in the areas where they are specifically working. So this means that where you are grading your candidate as stage 3, if they then cannot show stage 3 in the exam, they will fail. Okay, even if they're showing stage 2 across the board, they must have stage 3 in those areas where they are specifically working. And stage 3 in the new syllabus is quite different to stage 3 in the old syllabus. So let's have a look at that. At stage 3, they've got a thorough knowledge of the areas encompassed, and they have applied that knowledge. So this is the areas where they are specifically working. They understand the implications of actions, they take responsibility for them, and they need little supervision. So this is quite a big change, because it means that a candidate without any stage 3s won't have a notification approved. The candidate must have some stage 3s, and as I say, they must be able to show evidence and, must be able to talk sufficiently to the examiners about those areas at a stage 3 level for the examiners to be satisfied that they are suitable to become chartered. Okay, so we've also got a new stage, a stage 4. Now, this is where you are the expert. You yourselves may well have 1 or 2 stage 4s if you now assessed yourselves against the syllabus areas. People who have stage 4 are the kind of people who are talking on Talking Landscape, answering questions about topic areas like your Colin Moores, or people involved with writing GLBIA rather than just implementing it. It's people who are offering workshops on this kind of thing. Other people will ring them up and ask them questions about it because they have so much experience of it. It is very unlikely that anyone on the pathway would get a level 4. However, it is possible because we get some senior people who have been practicing for 20, 30 years who just never become chartered before, hence it being included. However, it's not a requirement, and it really is extremely rare that just an average candidate, certainly one that just joined the pathway from university, would ever get a stage 4. So it's not a requirement, and I wouldn't expect any of you to give your candidate stage 4 at any time during the pathway. It's purely there to reflect the more experienced people who come along from time to time. So we've talked about the stage definitions. Let's talk about how you actually assess your candidate's knowledge against them. And the thing to always remember is in the exam, and here I am going on about the exam again, in the exam they will be asked questions by strangers who only know about their work from what they've read in their submissions and your mentor reviews, who don't know what, that thing is on the tip of my tongue, that thing that we worked on last week, where that guy did that, what's it? They're not going to know what any of that means. So when you're testing your candidate's knowledge, you can't accept that kind of answer. They'll also be asked these questions in a stressful situation, and they'll have limited time in which to prove that they have the knowledge that's required to become chartered. So whenever you're assessing your candidate's knowledge, it's not just whether they can do these things in the office, it's whether they can talk about them and whether they can talk about them to pretty much anybody who had the background knowledge to ask them the questions. Now, there's more about assessing your candidate in the specific webinar on assessing your candidate, which I believe is called Assessing Your Candidate and the Initial Review. So I'll go into assessing your candidate in more detail in that one, which I guess is either tomorrow or Thursday, but recordings of all of these webinars will be up on YouTube if you haven't had a chance to sign up for that one. What your supervisor needs when they're reading your mentor review is specifically information from the candidate, which is then backed up by verification from you. So they want to see in the mentor review that you discussed this issue with your candidate, that you asked some questions about X, Y, Z, that you took them through, a planning application or a report or something like that, and that you discussed the implications of it. Basically just how you verified that they really did know whatever it is that the syllabus area relates to. The other thing your supervisor needs from you is succinct and timely submissions. So same as a candidate, the supervisor doesn't need you to write huge, great reams of text. They just need succinct comments. If you're not giving them enough information, they'll mention that to you. It's not a bad thing. They may say to you or the candidate to write more or even to write less. But most of all, they need those submissions to be on time. And lastly, they also want some evidence that you have reflected on the previous supervisor feedback. If you don't agree with the supervisor feedback, feel free to say that. If it would be useful for you to have more guidance on a specific topic, or for them to answer a question about something or other, then mention that. Where on your mentor review, where you're asked to respond to the previous supervisor feedback. Okay, so it can be a two-way process. It doesn't need to be just them responding to you or them feeding back to you. Incidentally, if you did want to contact your supervisor outside of the regular cycle, or quarterly cycle, you do have your supervisor's email address. If you go to the My Candidates list, on the far right-hand side of that table, your email address, which your supervisor has, and your supervisor's email address is there, so you can contact them. However, most questions can be answered by me. If they have anything to do with procedural deadlines, certainly anything to do with extensions or notifications, that can all be answered by me. So if you're unsure of something, give me a call or drop me an email in the first instance, and then we can always pass it on to your supervisor if I'm not sure. So that is essentially mentoring for beginners. That was a whistle-stop tour of all the basics. So what we looked at is why the pathway is as it is and how the life cycle of a candidate on the pathway fits together. You'll remember that they come in and then they go off and they plan and they do and they review, and then you have your mentor review over here, and then there's some supervisor feedback, and if you want to add a notification, that's part of your mentor review. Supervisor says yes or no, If they say yes, then the candidate goes off to the exam, and if they say no, then the candidate goes back around this circle until you feel that they're ready, or that you've answered any issues that the supervisor had, and at that point the supervisor says yes, and off they go to the exam, and so on. So there's no minimum time that the candidate can spend going around. There's no maximum time either. So if they suddenly decide to start a new version of the Waltons and have a succession of children, that's entirely fine. If they decide to go off travelling for 3 years or something like that, that's fine as well. So there's no maximum time. We talked about the role of the mentor and how the role of the manager and the mentor varies, and how important it is to make time for mentoring. And yeah, as I said, the key to success. And then we talked about deadlines, and what would be really great is if everyone who watches this webinar immediately goes away, and if you haven't already, adds the deadlines into your diary. 7th of October is the next one, and maybe set yourself a reminder for 2 weeks beforehand, just to see how your workload is and see whether you need your candidate to submit earlier, or set the reminder for a month beforehand if that's more useful. We've talked about the stages. Now, it's really important that you discuss the stage definitions with your candidate, because remember, they're new. If they weren't on the old syllabus, then they're new to you anyway. But if they were on the syllabus, they have changed, as has the exam requirements. So it's really important that you discuss both of those with your candidate, and you agree, where the candidate is against the new syllabus. So something there to do at your next mentor meeting with them. And then your mentor reviews. Have a look at your last one and just consider, does it give the supervisor what they need? Is it correlating with what the candidate has submitted? Am I asking the supervisor for what I need from them in the little bit that responds to their previous feedback? Am I providing information that emphasizes how I've tested the candidate's knowledge? Okay, so that's everything I wanted to cover. Let's just have a look. Now, I've got a few comments in the comment section, mainly no actual questions. It's just Peter very kindly telling me it was Edward de Bono, of course, or Bono possibly if you're Irish, who had the multicoloured hats. Yeah, I think there were 7 of them, or was it 10 maybe, or possibly only 5 anyway. Terrible things what age does to your mind. But anyway, so that's very useful. Thank you, Peter. And in fact, Edward de Bono is yeah, quite an interesting author to read, although I've always found small sections of his text are often best, rather than trying to adopt the whole thing at once. 6 thinking hats, sorry, that's the only number I didn't say, I think. Anyway, I haven't had any actual questions submitted to chat, which I have to say isn't unusual in these webinars. If I have stunned you with information, then, so much for the better. Now you have a chance to sit back and just reflect on that while you take the last little bit of your lunch hour, if that's what this is. If you think of any questions later on this afternoon or tomorrow in the future, give me a ring or just drop me an email. It's the usual email address, pathway@landscapeinstitute.org. Will always find me or Tom, my colleague. And otherwise, I hope you found this webinar useful, and I'll be putting a recording of it up on YouTube at the beginning of next week. Okay, thank you very much for attending, and don't forget to get in touch if you do think of any questions later. Thanks, bye.